Hi there. Today I thought I'd do another debunking video, as we haven't done one in a while. If you're like me, frequently cursed by the YouTube recommendation algorithm, then you probably came across this video that's been recommended quite a bit. 5 Socialist Myths by a channel called John Stossel. Intrigued, I clicked it, and boy do I regret it. So what is John Stossel, or who is John Stossel? The Americans among you might already know, but I had no idea. Honestly, looking at this dude, I was confused. He looks like the sort of guy that sells off-brand soda here in Iraq, but apparently he's an American newscaster that used to work for Fox News. A noted libertarian, he's shared bits of wisdom like, "The free market is voluntary, everyone gets to choose his own path. That's justice. Injustice is forcing people to do what their rulers decide is fair." Yeah, having the free market decide that you're in too low of an income bracket to provide decent housing or healthcare for definitely is justice. He is also noted for stating, and I quote, "It should be the right of private businesses to be racist." Very upstanding citizen, he is. He's also known for running a multi-year show titled Stossel, in which he entertained guests and supported their positions on climate change denial, privatizing healthcare, fawning over the glorified toilet paper that is Atlas Shrugged, reducing taxes on the rich, opposition to a minimum wage, less regulation, the usual libertarian nonsense. Surprisingly, or better yet disappointingly, he's quite popular in the US. What's even more surprising to me, though, is that he also hits something called Stossel in the Classroom, a program which basically exposes millions of American elementary and high school students to his climate change denial and other such propaganda in schools. A few Americans have even told me that they were shown his videos in university. So, you may not be surprised to find out that his 2 foundations, the Reason Foundation and the Center for Independent Thought, funnily enough, are funded by the fossil fuel industry. The Cato Institute, which also funds PragerU, also happens to throw some money towards this guy. For all this money, though, he's been lauded for being a less than honest journalist, to say the least. I can't imagine why. Basically, your usual capitalist shill that lies through his teeth for a paycheck from industries hell-bent on destroying the earth for profits. How lovely. Now, what could such a respectable individual have to say about socialism? Let's take a look.
People eagerly find fault with capitalism.
If capitalism works, if this is the best we got, why does it seem to give such a raw deal?
A raw deal? Is that what we get?
Oh god, I don't want anything raw from you, Habibi, please. I'm trying to keep this video monetized.
I hear that from people now working for Joe Biden.
Do I look like a radical socialist?
No, you look like an establishment Democrat that's itching to get another war going, like all your predecessors.
Not especially, but with so many upset about America's wealth disparities. It's time to take a closer look at the socialism these people want.
This is class war!
We are committed to transforming our society into one based on freedom, equality, and solidarity.
The belief that socialism will bring that is why it's now as popular as capitalism among young people.
One, it already did bring that historically, but secondly, I really don't like the wording of this poll. What they mean by socialism is social democracy, usually, which is infinitely disappointing. Also, capitalism being popular with young adults just means that there's a whole lot of people that don't know their class interests. It's surprising the number isn't higher, though, since capitalism is basically America's civil religion at this point.
Another big reason is, oddly, this 90-year-old, linguist Noam Chomsky. Students study his work in class, and colleges pay him up to $30,000 to speak.
Thanks very much.
Yet for generations, Chomsky misled students by calling capitalism a grotesque catastrophe.
Chomsky has done his share of good, but also has been somewhat detrimental to socialism with his incredibly skewed perspectives on historically existing socialism. If you want to learn a bit about the faults of former socialism as well as the Chomsky type of ineffectual criticism, you can check out these 2 videos of mine here. Otherwise, check out Chomsky's greatest works, Manufacturing Consent, or the book it may have been inspired from, Michael Parenti's Inventing Realities, which is a superior book on the topic in my opinion.
I thought the fall of Soviet communism would put an end to such nonsense. Surely everyone would now see the catastrophe is socialism. But no, socialism has come back strong.
I thought the fall of Republican Spain, or Weimar Republic, or Allende's Chile would put an end to democracy. I thought the fall of the numerous Portuguese republics or the dozens of other failed capitalist states would put an end to capitalism. You see how stupid this sounds? Regardless, the USSR and Soviet socialism didn't fall. It was illegally and undemocratically dissolved against the will of the Soviet people. I've done a video on this here. Also, fighting socialism globally with every means at their disposal, from rigging elections all throughout the world against communist parties, or setting up secret anti-communist NATO armies, or diplomatically and financially supporting anti-communist fascist militias across Latin America, or overthrowing democratically elected socialists and putting fascists in power in their place, or massacring hundreds of thousands of suspected communists in order to quell the popularity of socialism by terror, or the other countless horrific ways the US and their NATO allies have helped murder, destroy, or otherwise impede a widely and massively popular social and political movement in every corner of the earth can, unsurprisingly, cause it to take a few attempts to perfect. And even the few attempts that existed succeeded magnificently given their conditions. The real catastrophe is capitalism, an untenable and flawed system that, if we do not abolish, will end up abolishing us as a species.
So in this video and the next, we'll bust 5 myths about socialism. The first is the claim that wasn't real socialism.
Finally, we get to the myths. Now, I don't know a single Marxist, and I've been part of the left for quite a while now, that claim that the USSR, the PRC, or Cuba, or the GDR, Vietnam, or the many other examples were not real socialism. This is more of an anarchist or social democrat talking point. Very roughly, for Marxists, socialism is, and I quote a previous video, political power and the state is in the hands of the working class, through vanguard parties, working class organizations, or otherwise. There is the nationalization of industry and collectivization of agriculture. There is the institution of a national economic plan for the development of the economy and society. There is a reorganization of workplaces from the top-down capitalist enterprise model to either state-owned or collective organization based on differing levels of self-management. There is suppression of markets, or elimination if possible, and the elimination of wage labor. There is necessary social reorganization in the form of a cultural revolution which seeks to support the creative and emancipatory political will of the people, as well as weed out reactionary ideas like racism and sexism, etc., through re-education and discussion, among several other things. If it had these things in a rough outline, it is socialism. Now, why do certain other sectors of the left use the "it's not real socialism" talking point? Simple, they want to distance themselves from what is widely assumed and usually incorrect about formerly existing socialisms. I can refer you to my 2 previous videos on leftist criticism of former socialism, as well as the trend of left-wing anti-communism that takes the form of incorrect, misplaced, or outright wrong criticism of former socialisms. Check them out for more information.
The Soviet Union, this was about as remote from socialism as you can imagine.
It's absurd to say that the Soviet Union was remote from socialism.
Economist Ben Powell reminds us that when the Soviets made private business illegal,
That's about as close as the world ever saw to the pure socialist end of the spectrum.
The anti-communist side isn't much better, as you can see. Yes, elimination of private property is a very, very important factor, but isn't absolutely everything.
But whenever socialism fails, people always say, that wasn't real socialism.
First of all, I love the choice of images, really putting the ideology to work there. You know, I could do the same. Show footage of people on a boat somewhere with no context, a few lines, empty store shelves, and a ridiculously handsome man giving a speech to show how much capitalism sucks. This is done intentionally to reinforce certain biases the school system and the media and popular culture try to drill into you. It's surprising that they didn't use a picture of satellites and Sputniks, which were socialist projects that brought humanity to the cosmos, and footage of children eating, as socialist countries across the board had higher caloric intake and actually met the nutritional requirements of their populations, unlike their capitalist counterparts. And footage of women scientists, as socialist countries place a much higher emphasis on educating women and liberating them than capitalism ever did. And in fact, said socialist policies in the USSR were the reason the US even considered expanding education for women. Or the socialist international solidarity between nations, like Cuba's support for Vietnam during the horrific American aggression against her people. Regardless, our boy Stossel talks about the failures of socialism, but to quote said ridiculously handsome man I mentioned earlier, where is the success of capitalism in Africa, Asia, and Latin America? Stossel repeats the usual mistake of these propagandist types. He compares countries with incredibly poor starting points prior to socialism to nations that were already incredibly wealthy, for example comparing the USSR to the US, when a much more fair comparison would be to compare the USSR to India, or Brazil, or the North African and West Asian regions, all which had much closer starting points to the USSR than the US did. But no, they don't do that because they're intentionally dishonest and don't want to give you the truth. Instead, they want to sell you a lie of a system built on the exploitation of the third world, our environment, immigrant populations, and you.
Socialism means abolishing private property in the major things that go into production and replacing it with some form of collective ownership. In practice, this means state ownership and control, and the Soviet Union had an abundance of that.
Of course, the Soviet Union is now gone, so some say
There is no true socialist country that exists today.
But there is. Look at Venezuela.
Just eating is a luxury.
When I say socialism created hardship there, people trash me on my own social media. Read a book. Venezuela's not socialist. Think a bit.
Oh Lord, there it is. Vuvuzela. These people are 100% right. Please just think for once in your life. I already dealt with this argument a few times before, so here's a quick rundown. Before that, though, I love the propagandistic food is a luxury bit. The reason Venezuela is having trouble now is because of American sanctions, economic warfare, and a highly underdiversified economy dependent on oil prices, all things the US had a direct hand in. You can't show something without the context. If I shot you in the leg and then you had trouble walking, that's because I shot you in the leg, not because of personal failure on your part. Take a look at the list I mentioned earlier, the abolishing of private property, collectivization, nationalization, reorganization, production, etc., and see if any of that applies to Venezuela. The economist Stosselbrot disproves this himself when he said socialism is when private property is replaced with some sort of collective ownership. Very little of that is present in Venezuela. In Venezuela, 2/3 of the economy is in private hands. Half of the healthcare is private. 80% of the workforce is employed in the private sector. If this is socialism and we applied the same characteristics to other countries, does that make them socialist too? If that's the case, why doesn't he consider Norway socialist as well? Sweden and France, they are all more socialist by those very same criteria. France, Norway, Sweden, and other European countries have larger public sectors and public programs, sometimes by a much larger margin. This is all socialism, right? No. In reality, neither those countries nor Venezuela are socialist. This isn't a not true socialism argument. This is a they definitely aren't socialist argument. Cuba, the USSR, the GDR, etc. These countries can legitimately be considered to be socialist, but not Norway, France, or Venezuela. Please just learn the definitions, I beg of you.
I'll do better than that. I'll listen to the politician who wrecked Venezuela.
Oh God, for the love of God, please, just go ask poor Venezuelans if Chavez wrecked Venezuela. They're the ones who resisted your government's coup attempts time and time again, after all.
El capitalismo es el reino de la injusticia.
Because capitalism is tyranny. Hugo Chavez said his government must take over businesses.
¿Y este edificio? Es un edificio que tiene comercio privado de joyería. Expropiese. Expropiese.
That's socialism.
Another out-of-context clip that doesn't count as evidence. These are numbers we can check, please. The private sector is still the dominant sector within the economy. Just because Venezuelan oil was nationalized doesn't make it socialism. Countless European nations have nationalized industries to some extent. Does that make them socialist? Again, the answer is no.
The socialists turned the richest country in Latin America, the nation with the biggest oil reserves in the world, into the poorest country.
You could see this would be hard-hitting if you didn't build this all on previous lies. But no, you doubled down and lied some more. Stossel mentioned it being a prosperous country. For the rich, maybe. Conveniently, the 45% poverty rate that existed at the time, and the one that Chavez drastically lowered, is not mentioned. Why not mention why Venezuela is facing difficulties now? Venezuela faced coup after coup attempt, directly supported by the US government, which not only sent tens of millions of dollars to the opposition, but even as recently as last year attempted to send in special forces secretly with the task of arresting or assassinating government officials and community organizers. Thankfully, the plan failed, but this is not even mentioning the economic warfare and sanctions by the US, as well as indigenous difficulties within Venezuela. For example, receiving an economy built on nothing but oil revenue from that very same neoliberal era he hailed a second ago. When oil prices were high, high social spending followed. When oil crashed, so did the spending. It happened during the neoliberal era of Venezuela, and it happened again now. Later on in the video, they claim that other oil-dependent countries didn't do as bad as Venezuela, yet that's just blatantly not true. My country, Iraq, was also a sanctioned third-world oil-dependent country that saw its living standards plummet as a result of American aggression. They're just straight up lying. This isn't an issue of socialism. This is an issue of a sanctioned and underdeveloped economy that has been thoroughly imperialized and used to subsidize the growth of the largest economy and military power in history at the expense of the regular Venezuelan people. When those very same Venezuelan people finally decide to take their destiny into their own hands, the US turns around and sanctions them, coups them, assassinates or attempts to assassinate their leaders, carries out economic warfare, and does whatever is in its power to force its economy to its knees. When that happens, the US turns around and says, look at how horrible their situation is. It's all the fault of insert progressive force that has actually managed to improve the situation for the poor in that country. Be it Venezuela or Cuba or the DPRK, the story is always the same. Not to sound like a broken record, but if I shot you in the leg, you know the rest. Alright, now I'll skip across myth 2 because he keeps going on about how Venezuela is socialist when it simply isn't. But I'll highlight one thing here.
In our capitalist society, when COVID hit,
what did we start seeing? Millions of entrepreneurs adjusting without government orders of how to deliver their products and services.
Servers have switched roles to delivery drivers, while bartenders have turned into sales reps.
Restaurants installed the heat lamps, expanded patios, did delivery.
All the reporters complained about the absence of federal direction. No central authority could possibly direct all these individual adjustments in thousands of different places.
Are you serious? Honestly. Americans watching this, please tell me, did the magical market solve all your issues and make it so that nothing is wrong in the US now? Have we completely forgotten the millions upon millions of unemployed? What about the rent crisis? The 500,000 dead, for Christ's sake. No, guys, don't worry. Your grandparents dying was all according to the all-knowing invisible hands plan. Jesus Christ, how out of touch can somebody be? Also, yes, a government can coordinate all of this effectively. China, Vietnam, New Zealand, and many more did so and were blindingly successful. How can he say this as his fellow Americans go homeless or die? I genuinely don't understand. The rest of the video just complains that a car designed and produced in East Germany in the early 60s produced pollution. Yeah, no shit. So did every other car of the era. Then they compare said affordably produced family car in a nation with an expensive public transportation system that rendered car ownership practically pointless to a Porsche, a literal luxury car, complaining that said Porsche is more enjoyable to drive. Yeah, that's the level of honesty we're dealing with here. Stossel goes on with his delusions, painting economic planning as one mind having to be all-knowing, which is a hilarious caricature and very, very wrong as you may expect. Firstly, markets allocate according to profit, not need. They're a notoriously ineffective and unjust system of planning anything other than maximizing profits. Planning worked, and worked surprisingly well when it was done by hand. Now, though, all the former criticisms have fallen apart because nowadays we have modern computing. In your pocket as we speak, you have a modern smartphone that can comfortably plan very complicated multi-year schemes, and modern supercomputers can plan economies as complex as the US's. If you'd like further reading on modern planning, take a look at Cockshots Towards a New Socialism. Yes, I'll keep recommending this until all of you read it. If you're interested in reading more about East Germany, though, take a look at the book Stasi State or Socialist Paradise by Bruni Delamotte. They finally top it all off with claiming that US sanctions that have been on Cuba for over half a century aren't all that bad, and honestly, it's so fucking disgusting. Only the US can cripple a nation, support terrorism within said nation, and blame CIA-sponsored terrorism in the US on an innocent foreign government, by the way, attempt countless coup attempts on its government, and hundreds of assassination attempts on its leaders, and then turn around and be like, you guys complain too much, it isn't that bad. I really hope for Stossel and his buddy here that there won't be a day of reckoning when they'll be placed on sanctions so that they taste what their government has done to countless nations across the earth. Jesus, we're only 2 minutes in. Oh god, okay, let's get through the rest of it a little quicker.
In my last video, we covered 2 big myths about socialism, but we have more. So here's myth 3. Socialism brings good things if it's democratic socialism.
Socialism, just across the board, brings good things. You'd know that if you escaped your little bubble and did some reading. Regardless, this is another one of those memes that kind of just exists in the US and nowhere else. Democratic socialism implies other socialisms weren't, which is an incredibly ignorant position to take. Unlike under capitalism, where all power is situated with those that have the most money, under socialism, numerous streams of determining all aspects of life, from a constitution, to economic planning, to laws, and everything in between, are determined by people democratically voting, either directly or through delegates, to councils, congresses, and committees. Historic examples of socialism practice this, with certain limitations as a result of their conditions, of course, and currently existing socialism continues to do so, from Vietnam to Cuba. If you're interested in learning about this, then check out my book recommendations video on how the USSR worked exactly here. Otherwise, this video by Endymion is excellent, and so is this very interesting article by the Japanese Political Science Review titled Rethinking Soviet Democracy, Popular Participation in Family Law Reform After Stalin. Check them out.
The examples of failed socialism that critics use are not socialist democracies, but authoritarian states.
Democratic socialists denounce all that. The key word for them, democratic. They believe that both the government and the economy should be run by the people by way of the ballot box.
Esta es la hora del pueblo bolivariano.
But Venezuela's socialist was elected.
Aquí no hay dictadura. Yo he sido electo aquí 3 veces.
They can start off democratically elected, and then once they centralize control over the economy, it becomes impossible to democratically unelect them.
Economist Ben Powell.
Now, Maduro rules while ordering state employees to vote for him or they lose their job.
Maduro blatantly buying votes.
They put food aid stations next to polling places and you get rewarded with rations if you vote correctly. Now democracy there is a sham.
The claims of voter manipulation in Venezuela and Bolivia, etc., and all that have been debunked time and time again, so all this is outright nonsense. The food rations if you vote correctly thing is in fact not a feature of socialism, but a feature of capitalism. You've never seen third world voting in so-called capitalist democracies if you haven't seen people handing out sandwiches and school supplies for voting the right way, meaning for neoliberal candidates. Ask a Latin American friend of that and listen, maybe.
It always becomes authoritarian? Always?
Everywhere you try socialism, that's what you get.
Why?
It's hard to exercise political freedom if you don't have economic freedoms. If you're dependent upon the state for your livelihood, you lose your ability to use your voice to oppose them because you can be punished.
This is something that I want to touch on. Now, of course, literally everything they said was outright nonsense. There is no economic freedom under capitalism. Americans barely have enough money to survive $500 emergencies or a trip to the ER, let alone the thousands of dollars necessary to start and maintain a business. But that's not the point I want to touch on. What I want to touch on is this. Why is it that socialist governments that are besieged, constantly sabotaged, diplomatically isolated, economically sanctioned, targeted by CIA assassination plots and coup attempts, demonized in Western media to no end despite their successes in the face of all their adversities, why could they possibly need to employ authoritarian methods? I can't seem to find an answer myself. In all seriousness, that doesn't mean those governments were perfect. They did things wrong and deserve to be rightly criticized, as long as that criticism is nuanced, educated, and in good faith. A good book to give a chance on this is Parenti's Black Shirts and Reds, which I highly recommend. Otherwise, a great food for thought piece is Human Rights in the USSR by Albert Szymanski, which compares with the US. Give it a go.
But unfortunately, people don't realize that when they're promoting democratic socialism.
Democratic socialism is your kid's public school.
It's the researchers and scientists paid with our taxes.
It's our interstate highway system.
We're not purely capitalist. There are some industries that are government-owned, operated, and controlled, socialized, if you will. It's no accident that when you look at these and think about things that are inefficiently done and underperforming, our public education, our congested streets, these socialized industries don't work well.
One thing he got right is that, yes, these things don't mean socialism. Socialism is about the relations to the means of production, not just free healthcare and education, although those are highly important aspects of the policy of socialist nations. One thing he got very wrong, though, is the meme that because they're socialized, as he says, that they underperform and should be privatized. He, of course, omits the context, as expected. These things underperform because they've been gutted and defunded to shit, habibi. Had they had a proper budget, they'd run just fine. In fact, they'd run really well, like they do in pretty much the rest of the world. Private ownership means efficiency. This is a meme. It doesn't exist. And anyone that's had a privately owned electricity or utility provider can attest to that. Privatization turns things from working for need to things working for profit. Not exactly a smart way of running our most essential aspects of society. Ha-Chun Chang's 23 Things They Don't Tell You About Capitalism is a good read for further information.
But what about
Norway? It's as socialist as they come.
Instead of Cuba or China, think Sweden.
Myth 4. Socialism does work well in Scandinavia.
Alright, I'll skip myth 4 because he magically learns what socialism is all of a sudden and correctly states that the Scandinavian countries are not socialist. Strange how this flexibility of thought isn't applied when thinking about Venezuela, though.
Finally, myth 5. Socialism is completely different from fascism.
Oh lord, let me guess, red flags. Is that the level of discourse here? Are you just going to compare people marching next to each other or some shit?
When a congressman said,
the potential is out there for another Hitler, socialist like Hitler, to come along.
Another congressman said he was wrong.
It's the Nazis that's terrible, not the socialists. They were Nazis who killed Jews, and I get offended when you compare socialists to Nazis.
They were fascists.
It's true that fascism and socialism aren't exactly the same, but they do have a lot in common.
Oh boy, call me surprised. They thought they're clever when they put military parades next to each other. Hey look, I can do that too. The UK is fascist, the US is fascist, France is Huh, I may be onto something. Joking aside, anyone can play this silly Pictionary game. Look, here. These posters are all the same, so that means that the incredibly complex social, political, and economic intricacies all mean nothing, right?
They both replace market decision-making with command and control.
Outright lie. All fascist governments had markets and only started loose state planning of still private enterprises only when the war reached its worst points, just like all capitalist countries do. Hell, the concept of privatization was coined by Nazi Germany. Hitler wasn't a socialist, and neither was the German economy at the time socialist. Academics have proven this time and time again. Democratic Socialist 01 has a great video on it too, for those interested.
As an average person living your life, whether under socialism or fascism, you lose your autonomy, your control over your own future. Only under capitalism do you have the freedom to say no.
Alright, let me ask you Americans. Do you feel like you have control over your own future? When education is at monopoly prices, you have to take Ubers over taxis in fear of being bankrupted if you need a ride to a hospital, let alone treatment. Your rent climbs to 40, 50, or even 80% of your monthly salary. You have no employment guarantee, and bosses can do whatever they like with you. Is this the freedom this guy is talking about?
Entrepreneurs offer you their services. They offer you employment. You can say no and choose a better path for yourself.
The only freedom you have under capitalism is to say no to life-saving treatment because you know you'll be bankrupt and have to spend the rest of your life either in prison or wage slaving to pay it off. The only freedom you have under capitalism is to be forced to join the military and kill other workers that haven't done anything to you abroad because your family has no way of paying for your education. The only freedom you have under capitalism is to be forced to work 2 jobs to make ends meet while the richest in the country have practically doubled their wealth during this pandemic. Please, I hope you see this bullshit propaganda for what it is. There's a reason Stossel and his buddy here don't speak in facts, but in platitudes. They know they're full of shit. They're just lying for a paycheck.
We went to Socialism 2018, the biggest gathering of young socialists, and they pointed out lots of problems in the United States. Problems with migration, with war, with policing. The problems they were identifying were the product of bad government that the U.S. is giving them, not capitalism.
If this myopic nonsense isn't enough to show you that these people have no idea what they're talking about, well then I don't know what to tell you.
In the last 20 years, we've seen more humans escape extreme poverty than any other time in human history.
I wonder where the absolute majority of that poverty reduction happened. Could it possibly be the People's Republic of China? Fuck, at least stay consistent with your propaganda. When it comes to poverty alleviation, taking China out leaves a much less impressive picture. And that's that. Sorry, but I had to subject myself to this, so you had to be subjected too. If you enjoy what I do, then please consider supporting me on Patreon. It really does help. I'd like to thank my patrons, so thank you too.